Hey guys, how you doing? So it's late on Monday night, and I'm putting this together for you guys to have in class on Tuesday, because as you can tell, I'm not there. Sorry about the inconvenience. You guys have spent some time in class now doing some digging on the gods of Egypt and what is all involved in that and how some of that works. And what I want to do here is just something brief and walk through this paradigm. We were going to do some stuff with this in class. It'll be abbreviated on the video. And when this is done, then you guys need to find some memory verses to work on. Okay. And I'll make sure that those are posted for you. So you guys can be sort of cranking on some of those, but here's where we're at. So we've got God who has set up this conflict with Pharaoh, and he has intentionally set this thing up to be a conflict between himself and Israel, his firstborn son, and Pharaoh and Pharaoh's firstborn son. So what now is transpiring is a series of conflicts. And as God works through the sequence of the plagues, what we pay attention to is who's involved in God's activity. You got Moses and Aaron on one side with God, and they're doing some stuff, and they're messing with some things. But what does it mean, sort of theologically speaking, for God to do this and sort of beat up on Egypt? When we get to the last plague, God says he will execute all his judgments on all the gods of Egypt. And so the final plague here in the death of the firstborn is some sort of culminating event that involves all of the gods of Egypt. And we're going to have to talk about that. But it raises the question, if that's the case, then do the plagues leading up to that final one, that culminating plague, also involve the gods of Egypt? And it's no secret that there are specific plagues like darkness and like the Nile and frogs that have an intimate connection to other specific gods in the Egyptian pantheon. And so we're going to pay attention to a few of them in the video. You've dug up a few of them. Yes, archaeology joke. It sort of on purpose in there. Sorry about that. But what I really want to drill to is this idea of why this matters for what the biblical account is doing. Because remember, we've been stressing the idea here that the Bible doesn't necessarily have to be true history to be true theology. But when the Bible is insisting that its record is true history, that its history and its theology are intertwined. And what I'm articulating to you in the Exodus material is not only its history and the theology in the Bible about God. So the history of the Exodus is valid. The theology about the God of Israel is valid. But also there's another layer to that theology. That the theology about God isn't just sort of isolated to say, God's so great he can do whatever he wants. There's an intentional thing in here about God. It's God who controls the facets of life and death. On a really basic level, that's the run of the plagues. It's God who controls the facets of life and death. The Nile that brings life to Egypt, God has sort of put to death. And so it's not the God of the Nile, it's Yahweh. And now the statement about him being in charge of life and death has real teeth in it, because now it's saying specifically, there isn't this other God over here. There isn't this other entity over here who's doing its own thing and who is operating outside of God's power and design. That the God of Israel is the God who's in command of all of that. And so these moments in the storyline, in the Exodus event, yes, they're real history. And yes, they teach us something about God. But when we look at what they tell us about God in comparison to the gods of Egypt, what we end up with is a more robust picture, not only of the conflict that God has already set up between himself and Pharaoh and Israel and Egypt, but what he needs us to know about himself. Okay, and so we're going to unpack some of these theological layers today. We're going to start with the gods of Egypt, and then I've got a couple other pieces for us to pay attention to here. And then Wednesday, when I'm back, we'll carry this conversation on for just a minute, and then we'll get started on the history piece, right? Why this is valid history. So when we look at this, and we covered some of these already. So there's Nilus, who is the god of the Nile. And so when we get to the Nile turned to blood, Nilus is picked on. There's a few other gods involved. Sorry. There's a few other gods involved there. There's a god in connection to the Nile River, who's called Hapi, Hapi. Isis is at times considered in Egyptian mythologies to be the goddess of the Nile. She's sort of a mother goddess of all the gods and goddesses. And so she's in a very real way, a special sort of magical figure. And so all of these gods are their existence and what they're in command of is problematized by God turning the Nile River into blood. The primary is Nilus, the god of the Nile River, the spirit of the Nile itself, right? The frogs, we also talked about for plague number 2, Hecate, right? The goddess of birth and fertility, female woman with a frog's head. This is it, right? And it's punishable by death to kill frogs in Egypt during this time frame. And so we've got a whole thing sort of transpiring here. The goddess that's supposed to bring life is now sort of piled up in steaming piles of dead frog carcasses, and we've got a serious problem. The plague of gnats is an interesting one, because I think our first thing is to say, okay, so which god in Egypt is god of the gnats? And there's a specific there are some specific gods that overlap with that, like the god we're going to run into with the flies. On the other hand, though, the way to look at it is who's the goddess of the earth, of the dust, and that would be Set, S-E-T, is the god of the dust, the god of the dirt, the god of the desert. He's the god of the stuff that makes up the dry land. And so when it's the dust turned into these swarms of insects, what Set is in command of, what he is in charge of, has been loosed. It's now out of his control, and it's now out of control. Instead of it being something that turns into receiving the rain and the water and becoming a place where plants grow and life can flourish and develop, now what we're looking at is a thing that has been turned into these insects, which are swarming the land. And there's a problem because they're just everywhere, and it's what I like, right? And so this thing that Set is in command of has now run wild, and it's totally out of his control, and it's been transformed. It's been totally changed into something that it wasn't. And part of the deal here with Yahweh is that the God who makes the dust is the God who can transform it into something else. And so the claim here that Yahweh is doing this involves a claim that he's made the heavens and the earth. He's made the sea and the dry land. And he is the only one who can take that for what it is and make it into something else. And so that's part of what we're looking at as we look at this particular thing. We move on to the second cycle, and we notice a bit of an intensification. So from gnats now, we go to flies. There's a few, because the flies are so dense that they mess with the light of the sun. Amun-Ra is a bit of maybe he's involved here, but he's clearly going to be later on for sure. Okay. Really, It's the god whose title is, quote, the Lord of the Flies. Okay. The name I keep coming across and have come across in my research as I've played with this idea is Uatchit, right? Uatchit, Uatchit. This is the Lord of the Flies, right? And so, specifically speaking, there is a migratory fly population that moves in from areas around the Red Sea. That would be east of Egypt, right? Nothing good happens in the east. And they move west into Egypt for brief periods of time, and then they sort of migrate back out. And it's this migratory fly population that Uatchit and our Lord of the Flies is supposed to be sort of mitigating and keeping at bay. And again, like the dust turned to gnats, that's totally gone rampant and out of control. So too the flies now, and they're sort of terrorizing the village. Okay, 5, we now start hitting some really major players. The death of the livestock. There's a couple here. Hathor is a goddess often depicted with the head of a cow. She's really important in the care of the livestock and in how Egyptian society functioned, quite simply because without her oversight for the livestock, specifically in the desert place you're living in Egypt, chances are your livestock die. And so the Nile's been messed with early. Water issues have been plentiful, and now the livestock are starting to feel the repercussions of this plague sequence, and now it's specific, and it's a target on the livestock. And so Hathor is part of this. The other piece of this, though, is Apis. Often, you'll hear me talk about this as the Apis bull. Apis is the name of a bull who is sort of a divinized, deified bull that is connected to Hathor and is a symbol for fertility and new life in the livestock. Apis is also sort of the pet to Horus or Amun-Ra at times. He's sort of divine, but he's also sort of like the pet bull of all the gods, so to speak. And so there's a really interesting thing that's going on with this, and that's going to show back up later. First, the god who made the livestock is the god who's in control of the lives of the livestock. And that's kind of the claim here. Look, I can take the lives of these livestock because I made these livestock, and it's nothing for me. And he's making a distinction as well, right? It's only the livestock of the Egyptians. It's not the livestock of the Israelites in Goshen. And so now where things are getting distinguished, and Egypt's being ruined, and the Israelites are not. And so that's part of this. The interesting piece is then when we consider Israel going to Sinai, and at Sinai, Moses is up getting the 10 Commandments, and while he's doing that, the people of Israel convince Aaron that they need a God, and so he builds them a golden calf. In all likelihood, what was produced in building the statues of this golden calf is something that looks like the Apis bull. And so this is something that they've picked up, they've brought with them from Egypt that they have not relinquished. And when pressed and stressed, they default to the worship of things they are familiar with and familiar with seeing from Egypt. Okay, 6. The boils plague hits a god we know as Sekhmet. Okay, Sekhmet, Sekhmet. She is a goddess with power over disease. She's sort of like power over disease. That goes one of two ways. She's either friendly and in your corner and helps alleviate it, or she brings it upon you and she sort of terrorizes the village with plague and pestilence, which raises a question. We see another god listed as the god of pestilence, and that's Sunu. or Sunu, Sunu. Sometimes Sekhmet and Sunu are sort of transposed on each other. And so in a way, Sunu is a sort of Loki type figure, if you're familiar with the god Loki and the Norse myths or the Marvel things, right? This mischievous character who just sort of terrorizes the village. Both of those are sort of in view here, but really the big one is Isis. Isis, right? Isis is the goddess who's sort of queen of the gods. She's a major player. She's in the top 3 of the Egyptian pantheon here. The god that has brought life to the world around them, Osiris and some of the others, have been either brought to life in part by Isis activity, or in the case of Osiris, Isis has brought him back to life with her magic and her healing. And so this is a direct affront to these 3, right? Sekhmet, Sunu, and Isis. But Isis, because she can't undo this, it's only God who undoes this. 7, the plague of hail on the earth. And we have a couple here. Osiris, who's connected to the god of crops. Set, who is the god of the desert, right? The god of the dirt. Also, is in some cases and spaces connected to the thunderstorm because of what the thunderstorm produces for Egyptian crop. And so what the storm and the rains do for the earth is part of Set's responsibility, right? And so he's connected to some of this kind of thing. But the biggest one would be Nut, N-U-T, right? She's the sky goddess. And if you go back to that paradigm we drew, right, the earth is flat, it's got a big dome over the top, and it's built on pillars. The Egyptians had a very similar model, only that dome that's stretched out over and littered with stars in the Egyptian model isn't some just sort of top of the snow globe kind of thing. It's actually the goddess. She covers the universe like a blanket from the skies. And part of that is protecting and keeping safe these things that would otherwise be atmospheric sort of tragedies, like hail and lightning falling from the sky and terrorizing everything. Locusts, again. The god Nut is involved because the god Nut is involved because they cover the sky, right, and they block it out, which again would indicate something to do with Amun-Ra, right? And so we've got this overlap again a little bit here. And let's see. I'm taking a look, making sure I've got this labeled correctly. So on one chart, okay. So there's a couple of gods involved. Nut because of the sky, right? And they block out the sky. Osiris, in part because of his protection for the crops. And now the crops are destroyed. And so they're sort of on the minor end of the spectrum. And then there's Serapia, Serapia, right? This Egyptian god is a protector against plagues and swarms of locusts. And guess what? This god has failed because clearly Yahweh has sent locusts and it's terrorizing the village. So you've got a couple of big players like Osiris, who's up at the top of the pile. Nut, who's up at the top of the pile. Serapia, who's in charge of keeping the locusts at bay. And all of these gods have sort of failed in their responsibilities, or they're being overrun by what Yahweh is doing. Darkness. This is probably one of the biggest, and this will be the biggest one we've known to date in this, right? Isis, yeah. Osiris, yes, for sure. I've mentioned Ra or Amun Ra a couple of times here as we talk about this. However, when we look at this plague, the Egyptian legend around, let's see, the Egyptian legend around what goes on with the sun is a bit odd to us, but it looks like this. So every evening when the sun sets, Amun Ra would die and go to the grave. And then when the sun would come up in the morning, the god Amun Ra would rise to new life and hitch up his chariot and his horses and put the sun on there and carry the sun across the sky. And then he would die that evening and he'd be raised to new life the next morning. Involved in this process is Isis, because she's the goddess of healing, right? And bringing new life. But intimately connected to Amun Ra here is the god Horus. Horus is the child, the son that belongs to, let's see, belongs to Isis and Osiris. He's their son. He's responsible at the top of the pile. So these three, Isis, Osiris, and Horus, sort of manage the Egyptian pantheon and keep it all in line. And so Horus is in charge of waking up the sun. And Horus is responsible for doing that because Horus is manifested in the pharaoh. Okay, and so you've got Horus connected to Amun Ra and Pharaoh connected to Horus, and all of that is supposed to work together in concert to bring the sun up. And we've got this darkness that can be felt, and this darkness has now created a situation where the sun god's like dead. He's not getting. There's no new life in the sun. He's not being raised. He's not coming back. He's not doing what he's supposed to be. And for days, we're looking at a darkness that you can feel in the land of Egypt. This is all kinds of something is way off. And the God who in Genesis chapter 1 brings light and organizes the light from the darkness has now removed that organization and light, but only for Egypt. So we gotta be discerning here, because we're looking at a situation that's got a lot involved, and it's going to lead into what I'm going to talk about in a second. But the sun god is dead effectively. And the Israelite claim here is the God who made light is the God now withholding light. And that's our understanding of this as well. Let's go on to the death of the firstborn, and then I'm going to come back. Okay, so death of the firstborn, obviously it hits all of the major players we've already talked about. Horus, because Horus is a manifestation of the Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's firstborn is dead. Isis and Osiris, because we're talking about the top of the pantheon, and they're connected to the life of the Pharaoh in a very intimate kind of way. On the other hand, Pharaoh himself and Pharaoh's son are gods. They're deified presentations of human persons, right? Responsible for the whole life of Egypt, from the divine life of the gods to the lives of people on the planet. And so it doesn't matter. Now Pharaoh's firstborn is dead. Pharaoh can't stop Yahweh from doing what he's going to do. Only the blood of the Lamb can stop that. And so the God who's provided life and allowed life to continue in Egypt to some extent has now removed it completely, and it's gone. And here now the conflict has come to its climax, right? God said at the beginning, my firstborn son, your firstborn son. Pharaoh chose to not let him go, and so now Pharaoh's firstborn son is gone. However, Pharaoh, if he isn't like an actual firstborn, Pharaoh would have been considered firstborn among the gods and of primary importance when we talk about the Egyptian gods and goddesses. He would have managed the pantheon. He would have kept them all in line. He would have done all of that and more. And so Pharaoh's firstborn son is dead because that's what God has promised. But Pharaoh is still kicking. And that creates a bit of tension. Wait, hold on. Shouldn't Pharaoh be dead? Isn't he a firstborn? What's going on with that? And then as you watch the story unfold, it goes from the 10th plague and the death of the firstborn and the blood of the lamb that saves. Israel travels to the Red Sea where they get trapped. We're going to talk about this when I get back, this crossing of the Red Sea thing. And then they're trapped. Egypt bearing down on them on one side, the Red Sea on the other. They cross through, and now Pharaoh, the firstborn, goes driving his chariot into the Red Sea, and the walls of the water of the Red Sea collapse on him and all of his army, and he dies. They all drown. They're all dead, and that's it. But that might mean then that the plague that is the death of the firstborn isn't officially over until Pharaoh dies in the water of the Red Sea, which means that the destruction, hear me out now, the destruction in the death of the firstborn plague involves blood, the blood of the lamb, but it also involves water. And note the language. Israel crosses through the Red Sea on dry land. God has separated the waters, and he's made dry land for Israel to cross through. It's a creation activity, just like Genesis 1. He separates the waters. He's made dry land. It's a provision for human life. Now in the Exodus, he's separated the waters. He's made dry land, and it's a provision for human life, for Israel to live and cross through those waters. As Egypt enters the dry land God prepared for Israel, the waters close in on them. And now the waters that had been separated are no longer. And they wash back over the dry land that God had made. So in pulling the waters back, we're mirroring the separating of the waters in creation. And in letting them collapse on top of them, God's undoing the order of creation. And that's the last piece that I want to mention to all of this. All of these plagues have as part of their thing an undoing and unstructuring of the order God instilled in creation, Genesis chapters 1 and 2. And part of the effect, part of the effectiveness, part of the terror, part of how devastating these plagues can be is the fact that God is now undoing the order and the boundaries and the limits that he put on creation. The locusts and the flies and the gnats, none of them have a limit. They're all exceedingly, and the frogs as well, right? The river that's supposed to bring life now turns into something that's bleeding. So it's the undoing of God's creative activity that brings about this series of plagues. Okay, that'll wrap us. We'll pick up again on Wednesday. Thanks, guys.